Boost your hives with the power of pollen patties. Pollen patties can help increase your spring colony growth and maintain your hives through summer dearths. I've been using pollen patties for 4 years now, and they've increased my average spring cluster size by nearly 2 frames of bees. I learned this from commercial beekeepers, and they use it in all different types of ways to help improve their colonies, make more honey, make more splits. It's great for beekeepers use these pollen patties when bees are bringing in little or no pollen during different times of the year. Bees don't have any pollen coming in the early spring because it's not warm enough for the flowers to produce pollen or nectar or for the bees really to fly. So beekeepers use these pollen patties to help the spring growth start in the spring. Global patties suggest that you can add your patties on as early as 1 month before your first natural pollen. For me, I don't do this. What I do is I wait till the crocuses bloom at the end of March, and when the first natural pollen starts to come in, that's when I add my pollen patties. The bees react to the pollen patties by growing. The queen begins to lay more eggs when there's more pollen coming into the hive, and the same thing happens when you add pollen patties to a hive. So it helps the bees grow, and it just sends a signal that it's time to rear more brood and create more baby bees. If you have more baby bees in early spring, like let's say late March, you're going to have exponentially more bees in early May or mid-June, because bees don't grow at a steady rate. A 1 frame cluster can maybe keep about 1 frame of brood warm, maybe less. But the larger your colony gets, the more brood it can keep warm, and so the hive exponentially grows. The other way pollen patties can be used is to help maintain a colony size during the dearth. A dearth is when the bees aren't bringing in nectar or pollen, and you want to feed pollen patties when they're not bringing in pollen. So if the bees aren't bringing in pollen in, let's say, late July, especially if you're in the south, then adding pollen patties can be very effective because it tells the bees that there's some pollen coming in. So the queen will lay more brood, and instead of the colony size dropping off a cliff and decreasing really quickly, you can kind of weaken the drop and slow the drop down. You want the bees to rear less brood as they go into the fall and winter, but you don't want them to just crash as far as how much brood they're making. You want to slowly wean them off as the season goes on. And also, if you want to grow your splits during the pollen dearth, you want to add pollen patties, because bees that don't have a lot of pollen and are young colonies will not grow quickly during the dearth unless you give them pollen patties, or they somehow find pollen later in the year. But pollen patties are a great tool for maintaining large colony size or for growing splits during a dearth. Do you get a pollen dearth? Let me know in the comments. I don't get a pollen dearth the entire season, but my season in Maine is really short. So let me know in the comments if you get pollen dearths in the summer. I think it's pretty common for places in the south and even some places in the more southern United States. So let me know in the comments. The other way I think about it when adding pollen patties is in the springtime, you can add pollen patties to increase the spring growth, but there's also another idea within that, which is if you have 4 or 5 days where it's really sunny and the bees are bringing in tons of pollen, happens in springtime, and then you get 4 or 5, 6 days of weather where it's raining or it's cold or both. Both of those things will stop the bees from collecting pollen. So during that time, they may not have stored much pollen when it was good weather because it's so early in spring. So they'll start a lot of brood, but then when the bad weather hits, they won't be able to maintain that brood, and the bees will cannibalize it and eat it for their proteins that they've invested into it. And so by adding a pollen patty, you keep that constant source of food on the hive. Ian calls it smoothing over the nutritional gaps. So if you're able to add those pollen patties at the apt time in spring, not only does it just increase the amount of brood that the queen's laying, but it also helps maintain the amount of brood that they have once they start growing from the natural pollen in the springtime. I want to address several common reasons why people don't use pollen patties. One, they say it leads to swarming. And as in all things with beekeeping, there are no absolutes. But in this case, swarming doesn't always lead to or pollen patties don't always lead to swarming. If you only add pollen patties to your small colonies, that will prevent pretty much any chance of pollen patties causing swarming, because adding pollen patties will increase their size, but certainly not enough to make them swarm. It's just not possible. And then my other answer to that is equalize. So if you feed your largest colony pollen patty in late March and I get my first inspection in mid-April, 3 weeks later, maybe they're filling all 10 frames of the box, but one, they can't really swarm in mid-April, it's too cold. And two, I would equalize all the frames. So if they have 7 frames of brood in mid-April, I take 3 or 4 of those frames out and give them all to smaller colonies. And so I've captured that growth that the bees made, and I've siphoned it off to other hives that are small, but have good queens and could grow if they have the right circumstances. So that's how you either equalize, you only feed it to your small colonies, and that will prevent any swarming that you could potentially get from pollen patties. Different beekeepers also make the argument that if you add pollen patties to hives that are light in food stores, when they make more brood, they'll eat more honey. And so you'll lead your hive into starving. And while this has happened to many beekeepers, it's pretty easily preventable. All you have to do is lift the back of the hive. If you lift the back of your beehive in springtime before adding the pollen patty and they're really light, don't add the pollen patty. Just give it to your hives that have plenty of food. And by that, you'll prevent any chance of starving due to the pollen patty. They still may starve, but it won't be because you used a pollen patty. It'll just be because they didn't have much brood. One of the other criticisms I've heard about using pollen patties is that it'll force the bees to create too much brood too early in the year, and then they'll freeze because of it. The answer for me is pretty easy with that question. I don't add any of the pollen patties till my first pollen comes in. There's still a chance of them freezing because they have too much brood due to the pollen patties, but if you wait till the first natural pollen comes in, it will definitely lessen the chance of you losing a hive due to adding the pollen patties and them increasing their brood nest size. So it could be an issue, but overall, I don't think it's a massive issue that's gonna be like devastate your colonies. You may lose one out of every, 15 or 20, but it's worth it because they grow the brood nest so much. Now, last time I made a video about pollen patties, they were talking about how they're hive beetle breeding grounds. And to an extent, this person was right. Beetles really love reproducing in these pollen patties. But there are a couple quick fixes that will completely prevent this from being an issue. One, add only the amount that you need for each colony. So if it's a small colony, add a third or a quarter of a patty, and they'll still be able to eat that before the beetles will be able to reproduce. So even if you're in the heart of the South where there's tons of hive beetles, if you give them a small amount of patty on small colonies, they will eat it very quickly. Big hive, you can give them more patty, they'll eat it quickly. If the beetles get in the patty, it takes them a pretty long time to be able to reproduce. So if they eat the patty in 7 to 10 days, then the beetle larva will start, but the bees will finish the patty before there are any issues with the beetles. And with another way that you can help the bees is if you cut up the patty into multiple pieces, then it's much easier for the bees to access it. And so they can throw out more of the larva and it becomes even less of an issue. So if you split up the patty, it creates more surface area, so it's easier for the bees to control. So you're interested in pollen patties. You might consider using them, but you're not really sure how to actually put them into use on the frames in the hive. The first step is always to scrape any frames with wax. So if the frames have a lot of wax up here above the frames, you just take your hive tool and scrape it off. And what this allows you to do is actually add the patty on top. If you're gonna need a shim, so like some kind of shim or an inner cover that has space. But once you have that, it's still gonna create the inner cover to come up. When there's wax on the frames and you put the pollen patty on top, the inner cover won't fit and you'll leave a gap here, letting heat come out of the hive on the front. So you don't want to do that. You want to first scrape all the wax off your frames, then add the appropriate amount of patty. So for a really small colony, around 1 frame clusters, I would give them probably 1/4 of a patty right there. For slightly larger colonies, maybe 2, 3 frames, I'd give them 1/3 to 1/2. And then your really big colonies, I would give them a full patty. So I'm talking 5+ frames of bees. That's around what I do. These are all estimates. I'm not perfect at this. I've only been doing it 3 or 4 years now. So you'll figure it out as you go how much they eat. And I like to check the patties every 2 weeks. Only go into the hives to check patties when it's warm. If it's 25 degrees outside, you don't want to go into your hive and let out a bunch of heat to add pollen patties. Just plan around your weather and make sure that you pick good days and you plan out well what times you want to put the pollen patties in the hives. My best estimation is that it takes about 2 patties on average per colony. That's just from a 1-year sample size, so it could be different, but that's what I'd start at, is to buy on average 2 patties for every hive that you have. And typically I feed them for around 8 weeks till about mid-May. We get plenty of pollen in early May, and so all the bigger colonies typically stop taking them, unless we have a lot of rain and they'll still take them. But that's how long I typically feed them. Good weather, you won't have to feed pollen patties for 8 weeks. Some years I have, some years I haven't. It all depends on the size of the colony and the weather you get that year. A lot of people take the paper off these patties, which they're designed so you can do that. For me personally, I don't take the paper off my patties because I want them to stay as moist as possible for the bees. The bees don't like it. When they dry out, bees don't really want to eat them. And so the longer they can stay moist, the better chance the bees have at eating them. So I don't take off the paper, but a lot of people do take off the paper on one side. And if you give them more access by taking off the paper, that might help with hive beetles too. The bees will tell you when you should stop feeding pollen patties because they will stop taking them. And so when the bees stop taking them, you're only wasting your money to give it to them. So just keep that in mind. If you've only been feeding for 4 weeks and the bees aren't taking them, don't try to shove it down their throats. Don't keep giving them more. It'll just dry out and you'll waste your money. Only use the amount the bees want. And if you have extra patties, just put them in your freezer and they'll be good till the next year, no problem. I like to use these global patties, and they're 1 pound patties. I think they were around $2.70 per pound, and I ordered them from Global Patties. But some people use other patties. I think the bees eat these ones really quickly. They also have 15% real pollen, so they're the ones designed for spring buildup because the more pollen in the patty, the faster they want to grow. I addressed most of the concerns when it comes to pollen patties in this video, but I'm sure someone will say in the comments, well, you didn't talk about price. So pollen patties are relatively expensive, and I would like to become a owner of a beekeeping business. And so next year I'm going to do some tests where I test, roughly same size colonies, give one pollen patties, don't give pollen patties to the other. So I think that'll just help me figure out if it's really worth my money or not. I think that if I ordered in bulk, I could get them for around $2.50-ish per patty, which is a pound, so $2.50 a pound. And I think they're worth it, but I really want to test that assumption. So next spring I will be doing some testing and I'll hopefully be able to document it on this YouTube channel. If you want to see me actually do this in the hives instead of just using, an empty box, check out this video right here. I go through 8 colonies and add pollen patties to them and I walk you through the whole process.